£465,000. That is the number my accountant said to me over the phone, and I remember that the line crackled slightly, the way international calls used to crackle before everything went digital, even though this was a call from Chiang Mai to a firm in Leeds, and the connection should have been perfect. I remember the crackle because I was listening for something in it, some kind of reprieve, some indication that he was about to say he'd made an error. He did not say that. He said the number again, more slowly, as though I were the one struggling to understand. And the terrible thing is that he was right to say it slowly, because I was struggling to understand, and I had spent 50 years of my professional life being the person in the room who understood everything before anyone else did. I was a judge, Crown Court, for the better part of 2 decades, and before that a barrister for 20 years more. And if you had asked me at any point in that career what my defining quality was, I would not have said kindness, and I would not have said patience, though I hope I had some of both. I would have said discernment. I would have said that I could look at a person giving evidence and know, within minutes, whether they were telling the truth, whether they understood the weight of what they were saying, whether they had the capacity to be held responsible for their own words. That was the job. Fitness to plead, capacity to instruct counsel, capacity to consent, capacity to manage one's own affairs. I ruled on these questions more times than I could count, and I prided myself, privately, on being exceptional at it. Colleagues used to joke that I could smell a liar before he'd finished his opening sentence. I never corrected them. I believed it was true. I tell you all this not to boast, because there is no boasting left in me, but because you need to understand what the fall actually was. It was not simply financial. Financial ruin, on its own, I think I could have survived with some dignity intact. What I could not survive with dignity intact was the specific, surgical humiliation of discovering that the one thing I had spent my whole life being good at, judging whether a mind was sound enough to be trusted with a decision, I had failed to apply to the mind I knew best of all, which was my own. There was a case early in my time on the bench, a matter involving an elderly widower who had signed over power of attorney to a nephew he barely knew, in the months after his wife's death, while by every clinical account his mind was beginning to slip. Counsel for the family argued, reasonably enough, that grief alone can mimic the outward signs of incapacity, that a man can seem confused simply because he is bereaved, and not because anything is structurally wrong with him. I remember weighing that argument carefully against the medical evidence, and ultimately ruling that the arrangement could not stand, because the timing was too convenient, because vulnerability of that particular, grief-shaped kind is exactly the vulnerability the law exists to protect. I wrote, in my judgment, that the tragedy of these cases is rarely the absence of warning signs. It is that the signs are visible to everyone except the person living inside them. I did not think, writing that sentence more than 20 years ago, that I was describing my own future. I have gone back and reread that judgment since, more than once. And there is a particular vertigo in finding your younger self diagnosing, with total clarity, the exact mechanism that would eventually be used against you. I was, I think, a good judge, and I do not say that lightly, because I watched enough poor ones over the decades to know the difference. I was patient with juries. I was, colleagues told me, unusually good at explaining complicated psychiatric evidence in language ordinary people could actually use, which is rarer than you'd think among lawyers, most of whom fall in love with the sound of their own precision at the expense of being understood. Margaret used to say that my talent was not intelligence, particularly, but attention, that I noticed things other clever men missed because I was actually looking, rather than performing the act of looking while thinking about something else. I built 40 years of professional identity on the premise that my attention was reliable. It is a strange thing to have the instrument of your own self-assessment be the exact instrument that fails, silently, while insisting to you the whole time that it is working perfectly. It started so small that I did not register it as starting at all. A word gone missing mid-sentence, there and then not there, like a light flickering in a room you're not looking at directly. I would reach for the name of a wine I'd ordered 100 times and find nothing where the name should be. I put it down to age, the way we all do, the way everyone over 70 tells themselves it's just age. Everyone loses a word here and there, and for a long time, that was a reasonable thing to tell myself. But there is a difference, I know now, between the ordinary erosion of a vocabulary and the particular kind of fog that comes for people like me. And somewhere inside myself, in a part of my mind I did not let speak out loud, I think I knew which one this was. My wife had died 4 years before any of this. Margaret. I don't use her name lightly, and I won't use it often, but I want to say it once, because she was the person who would have caught this. Not because she was cleverer than me, she wasn't, and she'd have laughed at the suggestion, but because she watched me the way you watch someone you've spent 41 years next to, and she would have noticed the flicker before I did, and she would have said something, and because it was her saying it, and not some doctor or some form, I might have listened. But she was gone, and my daughter was in Manchester with 3 children of her own and a job that left her exhausted by 9 most evenings. And my son had emigrated to New Zealand a decade earlier, and our calls had thinned to a handful a year, warm but distant, the kind of calls where you talk about the weather in 2 hemispheres and hang up having said nothing that mattered. There was no one left whose job it was to watch me. I had not realized, until I needed one, how much of what keeps a person safe is simply somebody else's attention. Retirement had left a hole shaped exactly like my career, and I did what I think a great many men in my position do, which is mistake activity for purpose. I traveled. I had always wanted to see more of Southeast Asia. Margaret and I had gone to Vietnam once, in the 90s, and loved it, and I suppose some part of me was trying to recreate a happiness I already understood was not recreatable. Chiang Mai, when I first visited, struck me as gentler than Bangkok, more human in scale, and I liked the mountains ringing the old city, and I liked that nobody there knew who I had been. For 50 years I had been introduced as His Honor, and people had adjusted their posture accordingly, and there was something restful, almost intoxicating, about being simply an old Englishman nobody had heard of, sitting in a cafe in Niman with a pot of tea, unremarkable. My daughter, when I told her I intended to sell the family house and relocate permanently, was more supportive than perhaps she should have been, and I say that without any resentment toward her, because I understand now what I did not understand then, that a widowed retired judge announcing a fresh start in a warm country sounds, from the outside, like exactly the sort of thing a grieving man ought to be encouraged to do. She helped me pack. She flew out for the first month, to see the flat, to meet a few of the other expatriates I'd already begun to know, and she went home reassured, and I do not blame her for that reassurance, because I gave her every reason to feel it. I was, in those early months, genuinely happy in a way I had not expected to be. I joined a small reading group of retired professionals, mostly British and Australian, who met on Thursday evenings to argue amiably about books none of us had fully finished. I took up watercolors, badly. I told myself, and told my daughter over our weekly calls, that leaving England had been the best decision I'd made since marrying her mother, and for a period of perhaps 2 years, I believe that was true. I want to be honest about the years leading up to my move, because honesty is the only thing I have left to offer anyone reading this. The fog was getting worse. I noticed it and I did not tell anyone. I noticed it the way you notice a leak in a roof during a dry summer. Theoretically alarming, practically ignorable, until the day it isn't. I would forget whether I'd taken my blood pressure tablet and take it twice, or not at all. I would arrive somewhere and forget, briefly, why I had come. Once, humiliatingly, I got turned around 3 streets from my own condominium and had to sit on a low wall for 20 minutes until the shape of the street came back to me. I told myself it was heat exhaustion. I did not go to a doctor. I want you to understand why I didn't, because I think this is the part of the story that matters most, more than any of what came after. I did not go to a doctor because a diagnosis would have been a verdict, and I had spent my entire life handing down verdicts to other people, and I could not bear, genuinely could not bear, in some deep, unexamined region of myself, to be on the receiving end of one. The loss of my mind was, to me, a kind of professional and personal bankruptcy so total that denial felt like the only survivable option. I had ruled on other men's capacity for a living. I was not going to let anyone rule on mine. This is where she comes into it. I'll call her by the name she gave me, though I've since had reason to wonder how much of anything she gave me was true. Saifon, 29, from Chiang Mai, and I met her through the most unremarkable of circumstances. A mutual acquaintance, a lunch, nothing that in retrospect had the feel of an ambush, which I suppose is rather the point of a good one. She was warm in a way that felt, at the time, uncomplicated. She asked questions, and seemed to actually wait for the answers. She had, she told me, done some volunteering at a facility that supported elderly residents, and she spoke about that work with what struck me as real tenderness, the patience it took, the particular kind of loneliness she'd seen in men my age, who'd outlived the people who used to organize their lives for them. I did not think, sitting across from her with my tea going cold, that I was being assessed. I thought I was being seen. There is a difference between those two experiences that feels, from the inside, exactly the same. I am not going to walk you through, step by step, how the months that followed were engineered, because I have come to understand that some of what happened to me is not mine to narrate in forensic detail, not because I'm protecting her, God knows I'm not, but because I think there is something obscene about turning the exact anatomy of how a vulnerable old man was taken apart into a kind of instructional video, and I refuse to be the one who writes that video, even about my own life. What I can tell you is the shape of it, the way you can describe the shape of a wound without describing the weapon. Trust was built slowly, in the ordinary currency of company and attention and small kindnesses. And it was built during a period when my own mind was becoming less and less able to hold a clear, continuous picture of what was happening to me. Decisions were made, documents were signed. I want to be honest and say that I do not fully remember signing some of them, and that this not remembering is, in itself, the whole tragedy. Because a man who cannot remember agreeing to something has, by definition, no grounds on which to defend having agreed to it. I had sat on the bench for 20 years, asking witnesses whether they truly understood what they were consenting to. Nobody asked me that question. Or perhaps someone did, and I answered, and the answer simply did not stay in my head long enough to matter. There is a particular kind of shame in this that I don't think people who haven't lived it can fully access, so let me try to describe it anyway. It is not the shame of having been foolish in an ordinary way, of falling for a bad business deal, or trusting a friend who let you down. It is the shame of having lost the very faculty you built your identity around, without the faculty itself being intact enough to notice its own loss. Imagine a lighthouse keeper going blind and not realizing it because the light itself has gone out too, so there's no beam to notice missing. That was me. I was the instrument that was supposed to detect the failure, and the instrument was the thing failing. Looking back, and I do this compulsively now, at 3 a.m, replaying scenes I only half trust the accuracy of. There were things I noticed and did not examine. A folder of papers she once asked me to sign quickly, because she said she was running late for something. A period, I think sometime in the spring, when she was unusually attentive, unusually present, in a way that in retrospect had a texture to it I can't quite name but can feel, like a change in air pressure before a storm you don't yet know is coming. I remember thinking, at the time, that I was lucky at 78, widowed and half forgotten by my own children, to have found someone who wanted to spend her days with me. I did not examine luck. Nobody examines luck while they're having it. You only ever examine it afterward, forensically, the way you examine a crime scene, looking for the moment you should have known. The money moved the way money moves when nobody is watching the account closely enough to notice. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic theft that would have tripped some alarm, but steadily, across the better part of 8 months, in amounts that were individually explainable and cumulatively catastrophic. I want to say something here about my judicial pension and the equity in a house Margaret and I had bought in 1988 and paid off, slowly, over 3 decades of careful living. Money that represented not just numbers, but an entire life's worth of discipline, of not buying the second car, of taking modest holidays, of the 1,000 small denials that add up to security in old age. £465,000 is not an abstraction to me. It is 30 years of Tuesdays. I did not notice it going. This is the sentence I have had to say to myself, and to the very few people I've said any of this to, more times than any other sentence in my life, and it does not get easier to say. I did not notice, because the part of my brain that would have noticed was the same part that was quietly, invisibly, coming apart. There is a cruelty in this that feels almost designed, though I understand that intention and mechanism are different things. And my job now, sitting here, is not to relitigate exactly how deliberate any of it was. I no longer trust my own reconstructions enough to swear to the details, but simply to tell you what happened to me and what it felt like. It was my accountant who found it. James, not his real name, though it hardly matters now, had handled my finances for 11 years, since before Margaret died, and there was a quarterly review he did more out of habit than necessity, because for a decade there had been nothing to review beyond the ordinary drift of a comfortable retirement. I remember the email. I remember it asked me to call at my earliest convenience, which is the sort of phrase accountants use instead of the phrase they actually mean, which is call me now, something is wrong. I called from the small balcony of my condominium, looking out at the mountains I'd grown to love, and James's voice had a carefulness to it that I recognized, because it was the same carefulness I used to bring to a courtroom when I had to tell someone something they were not going to want to hear. He walked me through it slowly. Transfers. A property matter I did not remember agreeing to. A power of attorney document with my signature on it, dated during a period I could place roughly in my memory but could not, try as I might, actually recall signing. I sat on that balcony with the phone against my ear, and I felt something happen in my chest that I can only describe as the floor of my own life giving way. Not loudly, not with a crash, but the way ice gives way. A silence, and then you're simply somewhere colder, and you don't fully understand how you got there. I want to try to describe the hours after that call, because I think they are the truest part of this story, truer than any of what came before. I did not shout. I did not cry. Not then. I sat very still, the way I used to sit on the bench when a verdict was being read that I had already anticipated, and I found myself doing something that horrified me even as I did it. I began, almost automatically, to build a case. Not against her, against myself. I began cataloging, with the cold precision of 40 years at the bar, every moment I should have caught it, every document I should have read more carefully, every conversation in which some rational, undamaged version of myself would have asked a single obvious question and did not. I sat in judgment of my own defense, and I found it wanting. I have never, in my entire career, seen a verdict delivered with more certainty than the one I handed down to myself that evening. Guilty, not of malice, of the one failure I had spent my whole life believing myself incapable of, failing to see clearly. The days after that are not, in truth, entirely clear to me, and I've had to accept that this is partly the disease and partly the shock, and that I may never be able to fully separate the two. I know that I confronted her, because I remember the shape of the room we were in, though I no longer trust every word I've assigned to that memory. I remember asking her, directly, whether she understood what she had taken from me. And I remember that the question felt, even as I asked it, like a question I had asked 100 defendants across a courtroom, except that this time I had no bench to sit behind, no robe, no authority beyond an old man's shaking voice. I remember that whatever she said to me did not sound like someone who believed she had done anything requiring defending, and I remember that this, more than the money, more than the documents, more than anything else, was the thing that broke something in me that I don't think has mended since. Not the theft, the absence in her of the recognition that a theft had occurred. I have spent a great deal of time since trying to decide whether that absence was performance or genuine belief, and I have concluded, finally, that it does not much matter which. Either answer leaves me in the same place, which is alone in a room, having asked a question that nobody was ever going to answer honestly. A lawyer I consulted afterward, a decent man working out of a small office near the old city moat, was gentle with me in the particular way people are gentle when they already know the news is bad and are trying to soften the delivery without lying about the substance. He had a framed law degree on the wall, University of London, external program, and I remember fixing on that small detail while he spoke. The way you fix on something inconsequential when the thing being said is too large to look at directly. He explained, patiently, that a signature given during a period of documented lucidity is difficult to unwind, whatever the state of the signer's mind in the months surrounding it. He asked me, gently, whether I had any contemporaneous medical record from around the time the documents were signed, anything showing impairment on that specific day, rather than in the general period around it. And I had to tell him no, because I had spent that entire period refusing to let a doctor anywhere near me. I watched him absorb that answer without letting his face change, which is its own kind of professional kindness, and I recognized it, because it is exactly the face I used to arrange for defendants when I already knew, from the bench, which way a case was going to fall. He explained that Thai property and financial law, like the law anywhere, is not built primarily to protect people from their own past selves, and that the same would very likely have been true had this happened in England or anywhere else. That the law is generally built to protect the boundary of a decision at the moment it was made, not to reach backward and ask whether the person making it was, in some deeper sense, already becoming someone else. I sat in his office and listened to him with the professional part of my brain, the part that still, mercifully, worked well enough to understand every word of the legal architecture being described to me. And I remember thinking, with a kind of black, airless irony, that I could probably have written his advice myself, 20 years earlier, for some other unfortunate man sitting in some other office, and that I would have written it with compassion, but without any real comprehension of what it costs a person to hear it about his own life. He offered, before I left, to write to my daughter and explain the situation in plain terms, because he said, kindly and correctly, that some things are easier to hear from a stranger with no history to protect than from the person who lived them. I did not take him up on it immediately. It took me another 6 weeks to make that call myself. I did not go to the police, in the end, not because I didn't believe a wrong had been done to me, but because the shape of what had happened did not fit neatly into a shape the law could easily punish, and because I could not face, I will be honest about this too, the particular indignity of a courtroom, any courtroom, examining in public detail exactly how compromised my own judgment had become. I had spent 50 years believing that the law existed to protect people from exactly this kind of harm. I discovered, the hard way, that the law protects people best when they can still stand up and describe clearly what was done to them, and that the very thing that had been taken from me, the clarity, the certainty, the sharp, continuous thread of memory, was the same thing I would have needed to fight for what was taken. The isolation afterward was its own separate wound. My daughter flew out for 10 days when I finally told her, and I want to say, for the record, that I did eventually tell her, because I could not carry the whole of it alone, and I am glad, now, that I didn't try. And she was kind, and she was frightened, and underneath the kindness, I could hear the particular fear of a child realizing that her father is no longer entirely the man who raised her. I remember the phone call in which I told her, more of it than I remember of the confrontation itself, which is its own strange comment on which wounds the mind chooses to keep in focus. I had rehearsed what I was going to say for the better part of a week, the way I used to prepare for a difficult summing up, and every rehearsed version fell apart the moment I heard her voice, because I had forgotten, in 50 years of controlling a room, how completely a child's fear for her father can dismantle a man's composure. She did not ask, at first, how much money was gone. She asked whether I was safe. I had not expected that question to be the one that broke me, but it was. She flew out within the week. I watched her walk through arrivals at the airport in Chiang Mai, and I saw her doing the thing I used to do in court without realizing I was doing it. Scanning me, cataloging, checking for signs. And I understood, watching my own daughter assess me the way I used to assess witnesses, that some particular authority I had always assumed I held over my own life had quietly changed hands. We had the conversation, finally, the one I had spent years avoiding. A doctor's appointment, arranged before I'd even agreed to it, because she had made the call herself from the hotel the first night, not trusting me to make it. Scans. A diagnosis that did not surprise the doctor nearly as much as it should have surprised me, given how long I'd been quietly gathering evidence of it myself, and quietly refusing to read what I'd gathered. I remember the doctor being careful with his words in the way people are careful with a man they suspect has already guessed the substance of what they're about to say, and I remember being grateful, in a small and shameful way, that someone else was finally the one saying it out loud. There is a kind of grief that has no ceremony attached to it, no funeral, no gathering of people to say kind things about you, and that is the grief of mourning your own mind while you are still, technically, occupying it. I go through days now where I am entirely myself, sharp enough that I can write something like this and trust that most of it is true. And I go through days where I lose 40 minutes and cannot account for them afterward, and the not knowing which kind of day tomorrow will be is its own particular form of exile. On the good days, which are still more common than not, I read, I do the crossword in pen the way I always have. I telephone my son in New Zealand and manage a proper conversation, rather than the thin weather talk we used to fall back on, as though the loss has, strangely, made us less willing to waste the calls we have left. On the bad days, I have learned to recognize the specific texture of the fog before it fully descends, a kind of thickening at the edge of a sentence, and I have learned, slowly, to say so out loud instead of concealing it, which is the single hardest habit I have ever had to build, harder by far than any discipline the law ever asked of me. I think about the version of myself who sat on that bench for 20 years, asking other people whether they truly understood the nature and consequences of their decisions. And I think that if that man could see me now, he would ask me, gently, whether I understood the nature and consequences of trusting so completely, so late, with so much on the table. And I would have to tell him that I didn't, not fully. Not in the way I would have demanded of anyone standing in front of me giving evidence. I am 79 now. I live in a smaller flat than the condominium I once had, in a modest development back in England, close enough to my daughter that she can visit on weekends, which she does, faithfully, bringing the grandchildren more often now than she used to, as though she has decided, without ever saying so, that they should have as much time with me as can still be banked. We do ordinary things. She helps me sort the post, because I no longer entirely trust myself with anything that requires a signature. And there is a particular humility in handing that task to your own child that I do not think I can fully describe, except to say that it is the precise inversion of every year I spent teaching her to manage her own affairs. The house Margaret and I paid off over 30 years is gone. Most of the pension is gone. What is left is enough to live modestly, and not enough to ever again feel the particular safety I spent a career believing money and status could buy. I am, in the accounting sense that used to be my entire professional language, considerably diminished. In the sense that matters more, I am trying to learn to live inside a mind I can no longer fully trust, without letting that mistrust curdle into the kind of bitterness that would poison whatever years I have left with my daughter and her children. If there is a lesson in this, and I have turned the question over more times than I can count, it is not the lesson I expected to arrive at. I did not conclude that people cannot be trusted, though I understand why some who hear this story will conclude exactly that. What I concluded, slowly, and at considerable cost, is that the hardest capacity assessment any of us will ever have to make is the one concerning ourselves, and that the very qualities that make a person feel most exempt from needing that assessment, competence, achievement, a lifetime of being the one who judges rather than the one who is judged, are precisely the qualities that make the assessment hardest to permit. I spent 50 years asking whether someone else's mind was sound enough to be trusted with a decision. I never once, until it was too late, thought to ask that question of my own. I do not know how many years of clarity I have left, and I have stopped asking my doctor to give me a number, because numbers of that kind are rarely the comfort they pretend to be. What I know is that I would rather spend whatever is left telling this plainly than spend it protecting the version of myself who believed he was too sharp to be caught out. That man is gone, in more ways than one, and I find, to my own surprise, that I do not miss him as much as I expected to. He was proud, and his pride cost him a great deal, and I would rather be the man sitting here now, diminished, careful, occasionally lost for 40 minutes at a time, than go on pretending, the way he did for so long, that a lifetime of good judgment is the same thing as permanent immunity from needing to be judged. If you are reading this and you notice, in yourself or in someone you love, The small and easily explained things, a missing word, a lost street, a folder signed a little too quickly. I would ask you not to do what I did, which was decide that the asking itself was more frightening than whatever the answer might be. It wasn't. Nothing that came after was as frightening as the years I spent refusing to look.